power does not always collapse with the sound of gunfire or the weight of armies. Often it unravels in silence, in a single room where pride blinds the arrogant and the quiet strength of one person exposes everything. What began as an ordinary morning inside a glittering bank lobby turned into a confrontation that revealed just how fragile authority becomes when tested against truth. The moment seemed simple, an elderly black woman waiting in a chair, but the consequences reached far beyond that marble floor, ending with a revelation that left even the highest voices in the room powerless. This is the story of humiliation turned into justice, of arrogance shattered in an instant, and of grace that proved stronger than cruelty. If you want to see how each twist unfolds, make sure to like this video, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and share in the comments how the plot struck you and from where you are watching. Evelyn Johnson was a 72-year-old black woman whose life had been defined by resilience, dignity, and the constant battle of being underestimated. Her hair was a crown of soft gray curls that framed her proud face, and her eyes carried both the weariness of years and the quiet fire of a survivor who had endured much. On that crisp morning, she stepped into the towering marble lobby of Whitmore Bank, one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the city. She had made her way there with determination, riding 2 buses and walking several blocks, determined to arrive on time for an appointment that meant far more than anyone in that lobby could have guessed. Her modest coat was pressed neatly, her well-worn shoes polished, and in her hands she clutched a small leather purse, the kind she had owned for decades and never felt the need to replace. Evelyn knew that appearances mattered in places like this, and she had done everything in her power to present herself with respect, even though she carried the unmistakable mark of being different in a space that wasn't designed to welcome people like her. She quietly settled into a chair in the corner of the lobby, exhaling deeply, trying to calm her nerves as she prepared to wait. The bank's motto, carved in gold letters across the wall, read integrity and respect for all clients, and Evelyn allowed herself a brief smile, trusting in those words as a shield against the subtle hostility she often faced in public spaces. But that fragile hope shattered almost instantly. From behind the polished reception desk, 2 young employees exchanged sharp whispers, their eyes flicking toward her. One muttered, "She looks like she doesn't belong here." The other snickered, "Probably homeless. Why would someone like that come into Whitmore Bank?" Though their voices were hushed, the disdain carried across the open lobby, and Evelyn caught enough of it to understand the intent. She lowered her gaze, refusing to let them see how their judgment stung, but the weight of their scorn pressed on her chest. Around her, other customers noticed too. A man in a tailored navy suit paused mid-step to scan her from head to toe before curling his lip and striding away, as if her very presence tainted the elegance of the space. A woman adjusted her designer handbag closer to her body, giving Evelyn a wary glance, as if proximity to her was dangerous. Evelyn clasped her purse tighter and sat straighter in her chair, willing herself to remain calm. She had a reason to be there, a reason that would silence them all if only they knew. But the whispers and stares made her feel like an intruder in a place where she had every right to sit. The first twist came quickly. Rick Dawson, a security guard assigned to patrol the lobby, had been watching her with narrowing eyes. Tall, broad-shouldered, and in his early 40s, Rick carried himself with the swagger of someone who enjoyed wielding authority. His polished badge gleamed under the bright lights, and the heavy sound of his boots echoed across the marble floor as he approached her chair. He stopped in front of her, towering over her frail frame, folding his arms across his chest as though she were a criminal. "Ma'am," he barked, his tone sharp and dismissive, "this isn't a bus station. You can't sit here." His voice rang across the lobby, drawing the attention of everyone nearby, deliberately designed to embarrass her. Evelyn's heart lurched, but she looked up at him steadily, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not loitering. I have an appointment here. I am waiting for it." Rick raised one eyebrow and smirked, unimpressed. "Sure you are," he muttered, shaking his head like he was humoring a child. "You need to move along. This area is not for just anyone to sit around." The second twist unfolded around her. Customers nearby, who had overheard, turned their heads toward the confrontation. Instead of speaking up in her defense, they smirked, whispered, and chuckled among themselves. A middle-aged man leaned over to his companion and muttered, "He doesn't look like someone who has business here," loud enough for Evelyn to hear. A group of young professionals in suits exchanged amused looks, enjoying the spectacle as if it were entertainment. Evelyn felt her cheeks flush-hot with shame, and she gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her stomach knotted as the humiliation settled deep, heavier than the chair she sat on. Evelyn tried to push the unease from her chest, reminding herself again that she had an appointment, that she had been invited, that she had a reason to sit exactly where she was. But Rick's stare and the smirks around her made those truths feel irrelevant. "I have an appointment," she repeated, this time louder, hoping her voice would break through the noise of prejudice. Rick tilted his head back and laughed under his breath, then turned his head to the receptionist with mockery in his tone, raising his voice deliberately so the whole lobby could hear. "Hey, check the schedule. Do we have anyone like her today?" His words dripped with condescension, implying that Evelyn's very existence in the bank was impossible, that she could not possibly belong among the polished glass and steel of this financial sanctuary. The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Rick's authority forced her to glance at her computer screen, pretending to search, though she had no reason to. The damage was already done. Customers laughed quietly, and a young man in a tailored suit shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Evelyn's heart twisted. She felt as if she were shrinking under the weight of 100 eyes that no longer saw her as a person, but as a problem. Twist one had landed with brutal force, and she knew that whatever came next would only deepen the wound. She rose partway from her seat, clutching the appointment letter in her purse, ready to hold it up like a shield. But before she could, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What is going on here?" It was Linda Parker, the floor manager, a woman in her late 30s with a tight bun, sharp heels clicking against the marble, and an expression that radiated irritation rather than concern. She approached with quick strides, her eyes sweeping the lobby before narrowing on Evelyn, as though she had already made up her mind about the situation. Rick stepped aside slightly, gesturing toward Evelyn as if presenting evidence of a crime. "She says she has an appointment," he sneered, "but she's just been sitting here making people uncomfortable." Linda's lips curved into a thin smile, cold and humorless. She didn't even glance at Evelyn's face before speaking, her voice slicing like a blade. "Ma'am, this is a private bank, not a shelter. If you don't leave immediately, I'll call the police." Twist 2 came like a slap across the face. The words were loud, public, designed to strip Evelyn of her last shred of dignity. A collective murmur spread through the crowd as if the manager's declaration had legitimized the idea that Evelyn was an intruder. A woman gasped audibly. A man whispered to his companion, "Can you believe she tried to sneak in?" The narrative had been rewritten in front of her eyes. She was no longer a client waiting for her appointment. She was now a trespasser who had to be removed. Evelyn's chest heaved, her mind racing. She wanted to shout, to force them to look at her properly, to tell them she had every right to be there. But her voice felt trapped, swallowed by the enormity of the moment. She could almost see the invisible scales of power in the room, tilted entirely against her. Rick with his badge and his authority, Linda with her managerial title and her sharp voice, the bystanders who nodded along because it was easier than questioning. They all pressed against her like walls closing in, and she was the lone figure resisting the crush. The humiliation was total, orchestrated not behind closed doors, but in full view of strangers whose approval mattered to the bank more than her dignity ever would. Evelyn's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Crying would only give them the satisfaction of knowing they had broken her. Instead, she stood all the way up, her shoulders squared, her chin raised, and though her voice trembled, her words were strong. "I am not leaving. I am here because I was asked to be here. I have an appointment." But her declaration did not bring silence or respect. Instead, Linda rolled her eyes, smirking as though listening to a child's fantasy. Rick shifted his weight, clearly preparing to take action. Someone in the lobby chuckled, and another muttered, "Stubborn old lady." The injustice hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke her. The humiliation from the last exchange still burned in her ears, Linda's words about calling the police echoing. But Evelyn refused to move, her pride holding her in place. She reminded herself again that she was not here by mistake, that she was invited, that her presence was legitimate. But in this moment, none of that seemed to matter to the people determined to strip her of her dignity. Rick leaned down, his tall frame bending until his face hovered inches from hers. His voice low enough for her to hear, but sharp enough to cut. "We both know you don't have an account here," he said with smug certainty. "You're embarrassing yourself and making everyone else uncomfortable. This place isn't for people like you." Evelyn's lips tightened, her voice caught in her throat, but her eyes never left his. She wanted to tell him that she had been through far worse in her life than a puffed-up guard with a badge. But before she could speak, Linda snatched the appointment slip from Evelyn's hand. Evelyn had been ready to present it like evidence, a document with her name and the bank seal, proof that she was exactly where she belonged. But Linda gave it a cursory glance and burst into laughter that rang out across the lobby. "This," she mocked, waving the paper like a piece of trash. "This could have been printed on any office computer. What kind of fool do you take us for?" That was the first twist, the moment Evelyn realized that proof would mean nothing in the face of prejudice, so thick it blinded reason. Linda turned her back to the receptionist and smirked, as if performing for the crowd. "Do we look like we can't tell a fake when we see one?" she said loudly enough for customers to hear, and a ripple of chuckles moved through the lobby like a cruel wave. Evelyn's hand trembled, not from weakness, but from fury she kept locked deep inside. She had been patient, she had been respectful, she had come here with the truth, and still they laughed in her face. The crowd emboldened Linda further. She took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply on the marble, and stared Evelyn down with eyes full of disdain. "This bank represents prestige and integrity," she said with a smirk, "and we don't have time for people trying to sneak in with fake documents." Evelyn's breath caught, her pulse racing, but she still held herself upright, her shoulders square, her chin lifted. She was not a thief, she was not a trespasser, but she was being cast as both. Rick, still looming beside her, smirked at Linda's performance. "Looks like she thought she could outsmart us," he added mockingly, addressing the audience of customers rather than Evelyn. That was the second twist, the deliberate choice to make her humiliation a public act, a spectacle that turned her into a lesson for anyone else who might dare to sit in that lobby without the approval of people like them. Customers nearby nodded, murmuring in agreement. One elderly man whispered to his wife, "People like her shouldn't even try." A young woman in a business suit muttered, "Wasting everyone's time." Evelyn heard every word, each one a stone thrown at her character. She was being judged not on her appointment, not on her purpose, but on her appearance and her race. The weight of injustice bore down on her, and she felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought of her grandchildren, of the values she had tried to teach them about standing tall in the face of cruelty, and she drew strength from that memory. Her voice finally broke through, low but firm. "This is real. I belong here." But her words fell flat against the marble walls, drowned out by the laughter, by Rick's smirk, by Linda's cold amusement, and by the indifference of strangers who found more comfort in her shame than in the truth. She wanted to tell them that she had been invited by someone who stood far above their ranks, that her presence was not only legitimate but honored, but she knew they would twist even that into another reason to laugh. For now, she held back, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the truth to expose them for what they were. The atmosphere in the lobby had shifted completely. It was no longer a waiting area for clients, but a courtroom where Evelyn was both the accused and the condemned, with Linda and Rick as judge and jury, and the crowd as gleeful spectators. The gold letters on the wall still proclaimed integrity and respect for all clients, but to Evelyn they now looked like a cruel joke. Her dignity was being chipped away piece by piece, her humanity questioned in a place where she had come only to wait for her meeting. She clenched her purse tighter, her knuckles white, her breath sharp, but she stayed rooted to the spot. The arrogance of Rick and Linda had transformed what should have been an ordinary morning into a trial of character, one where Evelyn was determined not to let them win. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, yet she held her ground, knowing that if she gave in now, if she allowed herself to be dragged out like an unwanted trespasser, then every prejudice they carried against her would feel justified in their eyes. Rick adjusted his radio, pressing the button with deliberate slowness as if to emphasize his authority, and his voice boomed through the lobby as he called for backup. "Unit 2, come to the main lobby, possible removal needed," he announced. The words "possible removal" sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She wasn't a threat, she wasn't a criminal. She was simply a 72-year-old black woman waiting for her appointment. But his choice of words transformed her presence into a security issue. That was the first twist of this stage, the deliberate escalation of the situation from petty humiliation to the threat of physical force. Customers perked up at the sound of his call, their whispers intensifying. Some leaned forward eagerly, as if waiting for a scene of drama to unfold, while others shook their heads with feigned disappointment as though Evelyn had somehow brought this on herself. The indignity of it pressed down on her like a weight, but she did not rise from her chair. Moments later, the heavy steps of 2 more guards echoed across the marble floor, their uniforms pressed, their expressions already hardened with the expectation that they were about to handle trouble. Evelyn could feel the tension crackle in the air, the atmosphere turning hostile in a way that left her feeling more isolated than ever. She tried to speak, her voice firm but carrying the tremor of exhaustion. "I told you, I have an appointment. I belong here." But her protest was drowned out by Linda, who raised her hand in a gesture of authority and addressed the approaching guards. "This woman refuses to leave. She's disturbing the lobby. Escort her out." The words hit Evelyn like a blow, stripping her of identity, erasing her dignity, reducing her to nothing more than a problem to be handled. That was the second twist, the moment when Linda's disdain turned into outright abuse of power, weaponizing her authority to turn Evelyn into an outcast in the eyes of everyone present. The guards hesitated, glancing at Rick as if for confirmation, and he nodded with a smug grin, already imagining the outcome. Evelyn's heart raced, her stomach twisted, but still she refused to move. She sat firmly in her chair, her frail body seemingly small compared to the men who now surrounded her, but her spirit unbroken. A sudden voice cut through the oppressive silence, sharp and filled with anger. "Why are you treating an elderly woman like this?" All heads turned toward the speaker, a young man in his 20s named Jason Miller, dressed in business casual and standing near the line for the tellers. His voice carried across the lobby, and his face was flushed with outrage. For the first time since she had entered, Evelyn felt a flicker of relief that someone else saw her as more than just a nuisance. Jason stepped closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "She hasn't done anything wrong. She's just sitting here. Why are you trying to throw her out?" The reaction was immediate. Linda's eyes snapped toward him, narrowing into a glare that could have cut glass. "This is none of your business," she snapped, her voice rising to drown out his. "Mind your own affairs before you regret it." Jason opened his mouth to argue again, but Rick stepped forward, blocking him with his broad frame and shaking his head as if daring him to continue. The young man hesitated, the weight of intimidation pressing him back into silence, and Evelyn's fleeting sense of hope dimmed again. The crowd, instead of siding with Jason, shifted uncomfortably and murmured in annoyance, as if his defense of Evelyn was an unnecessary disruption rather than an act of conscience. Rick turned his attention back to Evelyn, his patience now clearly gone. His hand shot forward, hovering dangerously close to her arm. "If you won't leave peacefully, we'll make you leave," he growled, his voice low and threatening. Evelyn recoiled instinctively, her grip on her purse tightening, her breath catching in her throat. The customers leaned in, their eyes wide with anticipation, phones appearing in their hands to record the unfolding scene. It wasn't sympathy that drove them to film, but curiosity, the thrill of watching another person's shame captured forever. Evelyn felt the weight of their stares, the cruel satisfaction in their smirks, the indifference in their silence. It was as if the entire lobby had transformed into an arena, and she was the spectacle. Her lips parted, and her voice came out trembling but fierce. "I told you, I belong here. "You will regret this. You will regret this." But in the sea of dismissive faces and cruel laughter, she wondered if anyone had really heard them. The two additional guards stood behind Rick, waiting for his command, while Linda Parker remained nearby with her arms crossed. Her lips curled into a smirk of victory. Her eyes narrowed with disdain. The crowd leaned closer, hungry for the unfolding spectacle, eager to see the elderly black woman removed from the pristine sanctuary of Wacth. Jason Miller, the young man who had dared to speak out, lingered at the edge, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. But the intimidation from both Linda and Rick kept him rooted in hesitation. Evelyn's knees wobbled as Rick forced her upward, her purse slipping slightly from her lap, and in desperation she fumbled inside for the one thing she thought would silence them all, the envelope with the embossed seal of Whitmore Bank. She clutched it tightly, holding it out before anyone could shove her further. "This proves I have business here," she said, her voice quivering with both fear and fury. Rick sneered, his eyes flicking to the envelope, but before he could react, Linda stepped forward swiftly, snatching it from Evelyn's frail hands with a motion so dismissive it felt like a slap. She held the envelope aloft, glancing at it briefly, then scoffed loudly enough for every person in the lobby to hear. "An envelope with a logo," she mocked. "That's all you have? You think this proves anything?" Her voice carried a poisonous edge, dripping with mockery that reverberated through the air. She crumpled the corner of the envelope slightly, her manicured fingers crushing the symbol that Evelyn had trusted to protect her. That was the first twist of the stage, the moment when Evelyn's last shred of proof, her only defense, was openly ridiculed and discarded like trash. Gasps and laughter rippled through the crowd as Linda toyed with the envelope, waving it mockingly in front of Evelyn's face before lowering it toward the trash bin beside the desk. "This belongs in here," she said coldly, her hand poised to drop it. Evelyn reached out instinctively, her fingers shaking but determined, and with sudden force she knocked the envelope from Linda's hand before it could vanish into the bin. It hit the floor with a slap, spilling partially open, papers fluttering onto the polished marble. The moment felt like a disaster, as if Evelyn's dignity had been scattered across the floor along with the contents of the envelope. She bent down quickly, reaching to gather them, but Rick blocked her with his broad frame, placing his boot just inches from the papers as if to guard them from her. Linda threw back her head and laughed, her laughter sharp and cruel, echoing in the lobby. "Look at this," she said to no one in particular, gesturing toward Evelyn, scrambling for scraps, still pretending she belongs. That was the second twist, the deliberate public shaming not only through words but through physical denial, the refusal to even let Evelyn reclaim her own belongings. Customers murmured, some chuckled, others shook their heads, and more phones appeared, recording the frail woman on the ground at the feet of uniformed guards. Evelyn froze, her hand hovering just inches from the papers, her reflection staring back at her from the polished floor, and for the first time she felt as if she had been stripped of everything. Her proof, her dignity, her humanity. Rick bent down and grabbed her shoulder firmly, jerking her upward again, his grip rough enough to make her wince. Evelyn stumbled, her feet tangling slightly, and she nearly fell against one of the nearby chairs. Her purse slipped to the floor, spilling its contents, a worn wallet, a folded handkerchief, a set of keys, scattering like pieces of her private life for the audience to examine. A cruel chuckle rang out from the crowd, and a woman whispered, "Pathetic," while another muttered, "Why doesn't she just leave?" Evelyn's breath came fast, her chest rising and falling as she fought against the tears that burned hot behind her eyes. She could feel the judgment like daggers in her back, the weight of dozens of eyes that saw her not as a person, but as an inconvenience, a disruption, an object to scorn. Jason shifted again, his voice rising briefly. "This isn't right," but Linda silenced him with a glare so sharp it seemed to slice through the air. The young man faltered, his courage crumbling under the force of authority, and the crowd swallowed him back into its silence. Evelyn clung to the chair for balance, her legs trembling, her dignity battered. Every inch of her wanted to scream, to call out the truth, to tell them who she really was and why she had been invited here. But something inside her resisted. Not yet. She wasn't going to reveal her hand while they sneered. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing how wrong they were. Not until the right moment, not until the truth could burn through their arrogance like fire through paper. She steadied herself, bending slowly to pick up her purse and gathering what items she could, ignoring the cruel whispers and the smirks of those who believed they had won. She held her head high despite the ache in her arm where Rick's fingers had dug into her skin, despite the sting in her chest from Linda's words. She knew she was standing at the lowest point of her humiliation, stripped bare in the eyes of strangers. But she also knew something they did not, that this humiliation would not be the end. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by whispers of commotion, and the air thickened with the smell of expensive cologne perfume and the faint odor of arrogance that accompanied wealth and privilege. Evelyn had endured decades of subtle slights and overt discrimination, but never had she been so publicly ridiculed. Never had her humanity been dragged across the floor like a dirty rag. Her silence was not weakness, though it was calculation, and in the chaos of scattered papers, spilled belongings, and raised voices, her silence became heavier than all their noise. As Rick adjusted his grip, prepared to force her once more toward the exit, a sound interrupted the scene, sharp and metallic, a small clatter against the polished marble floor. From the side pocket of Evelyn's purse, dislodged when Rick had yanked her arm, a sleek metal card slid out and landed at Rick's feet. He bent automatically to pick it up, expecting perhaps a bus pass or some meaningless trinket. But when his eyes scanned the engraved letters, his smirk faltered for the first time. The card gleamed under the bright lobby lights, a heavy piece of metal embossed with the name Chairman Charles Whitmore, and his official signature etched below. Rick's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came out. Evelyn straightened slowly, her chin lifting as she locked eyes with him, her silence daring him to call it fake. That was the first twist of this stage, the unexpected appearance of undeniable proof that Evelyn was not what they had accused her of being. Rick's hand twitched as he held the card, uncertainty flashing in his eyes, but Linda swooped in before the moment could settle. She snatched the card from his hand, glanced at it briefly, and then threw her head back with a burst of cruel laughter. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving it at the crowd as if it were a toy. "Anyone can make something like this. A cheap replica with a fancy name on it. You really thought this would fool us?" She turned to the customers, her voice louder now, the performance grander. She thinks she can flash a fake VIP card and we'll suddenly believe she belongs here. Pathetic. The crowd murmured in agreement, some laughing, others shaking their heads in disdain, their prejudice more than ready to accept Linda's version of the truth. Evelyn's heart pounded as she watched her one piece of proof dismissed so easily, so cruelly, in the face of arrogance that cared nothing for evidence. Jason Miller, the young man who had tried once before to defend her, took a bold step forward this time, his voice ringing with anger. "That's not fake," he insisted, pointing at the card Linda now held in her hand. "That's real, and you know it. Why won't you let her speak? Why won't you check properly before you throw her out?" Linda's glare snapped to him, sharp as a blade, and she spat her words like venom. "I told you already. This is none of your business. Do not interfere." Jason hesitated but did not retreat, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving with outrage. The tension in the lobby thickened, customers shifting uneasily, torn between curiosity and discomfort at the possibility that the guard and manager might be wrong. Evelyn bent down slowly, retrieving one of the scattered papers from the envelope that had fallen earlier, her frail fingers lifting it from the marble floor. The bank's embossed seal shone faintly under the light, and though she held it only briefly before Jason reached to take it from her, it was enough to show that it was no cheap printout, but an official letter. Jason glanced at it and his eyes widened. "This is from the bank itself," he exclaimed, holding it aloft. "It has the official seal. She really does have business here." That was the second twist, the moment when someone outside of Evelyn herself began to see the truth, a voice willing to speak on her behalf against the tide of hostility. But before Jason could hand it back to Evelyn or present it clearly to the room, Linda lunged forward with startling swiftness, snatching the letter from his hands and pressing it behind her back as though hiding contraband. "Enough of this charade," she snapped, her voice rising high above the murmurs of the crowd. "This proves nothing. A seal can be forged. Documents can be faked. Do you think we are fools?" The crowd, cowed by her authority, seemed to accept her words, though the unease had not entirely dissipated. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest, but she refused to waver. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes locked on Linda's, her silence like a challenge that spoke louder than any protest. She knew the truth was on her side, and though they dismissed it, though they mocked it, she also knew their arrogance had blinded them. The proof had begun to surface, and their attempts to bury it only deepened the cracks in their facade. The two guards who had arrived in response to Rick's call shifted uncomfortably now, glancing at each other and at the items Linda had hidden. They were not yet ready to question their orders, but seeds of doubt had been planted, and Evelyn could feel the balance of power beginning, ever so slightly, to shift. Still, the crowd remained largely against her, unwilling to believe that the woman they had mocked and ridiculed might be someone of importance. Evelyn clasped her purse once more, her fingers steady now, her heart firm in its resolve. She would not speak her truth yet, not while Linda and Rick laughed, not while the crowd sneered. The moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would break their arrogance like glass. For now, she endured their cruelty in silence, her dignity intact, her eyes unwavering, her presence heavier than all their words combined. The customers in the lobby were caught in the tension, some murmuring in doubt, others still laughing nervously. But everyone knew something was changing, something they could not yet see fully. Then, like the opening of a stage curtain, the heavy glass doors at the front of the bank swung wide, and a sudden hush fell across the lobby. A man in a dark tailored suit strode into the room, his presence commanding instant respect. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with quiet authority. Assistants followed closely behind, carrying files and tablets, but none of them mattered because the man at the center was unmistakable. It was Charles Whitmore, chairman of Whitmore Bank, the most powerful figure in the institution, and the very name engraved on the metal card Linda had mocked only moments earlier. Evelyn's heart surged with relief, though she kept her composure, her silence turning into a steady shield as she watched the power shift before her eyes. Whitmore's gaze swept across the lobby, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he spotted Evelyn standing amidst the guards. He moved swiftly, ignoring Linda, ignoring Rick, ignoring the crowd, and came straight to her. "Mrs. Johnson," he said warmly, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "I am so sorry for keeping you waiting." He took her hands in his, squeezing them with genuine respect, his eyes filled with recognition and gratitude. The crowd gasped, some even whispering in disbelief. Evelyn straightened, her chin rising slightly higher as she allowed his acknowledgement to speak louder than anything she could have said herself. That was the first twist of this stage, the sudden and undeniable recognition of Evelyn as an honored guest, not an intruder, by the very head of the bank himself. The room shifted instantly, the whispers turning from ridicule to shock, the smirks vanishing from faces, the phones that had been raised to record humiliation now capturing an entirely different story. Rick's face paled, his smirk vanishing as though it had never existed. He took an involuntary step back, his authority crumbling like sand beneath water. Linda, however, attempted to salvage her pride. She forced a laugh, her voice sharp but shaking. "Mr. Whitmore, we were only following procedure." This woman refused to explain herself, and her documents looked suspicious. "We were protecting the bank." Whitmore turned his gaze to her, his expression hardening in a way that made even the air feel colder. "Procedure," he repeated, his tone cutting like a blade. "What procedure allows you to humiliate a guest, seize their documents, and threaten to throw them onto the street?" His voice grew louder, echoing across the marble walls. "What procedure justifies dragging a 72-year-old woman, who happens to be one of the most respected advisors this institution has ever had, out of a lobby like a criminal?" That was the second twist, the devastating reversal that stripped Linda and Rick of every excuse they had clung to. The crowd shifted again, murmurs of shock and guilt rippling among them, as they realized they had sided with arrogance and cruelty against a woman who had not only belonged but held the trust of the chairman himself. Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of triumph, but of quiet vindication. She had endured the humiliation, the ridicule, the physical aggression, but now the truth stood unshakable in the center of the lobby. Whitmore placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his eyes softening as he addressed her directly. "You should never have been treated this way. You are my honored guest, and more than that, you are a dear friend who once saved my family when we had nothing. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Gasps spread through the crowd again, this time mixed with shame. Customers who had laughed earlier now lowered their eyes. Their amusement turned to embarrassment. Jason stood taller, his own defiance vindicated, his earlier words proven true. The guards who had surrounded Evelyn shifted back further, their expressions conflicted, their authority stripped away as quickly as it had been given. Linda's face flushed with anger and fear, her lips parting as if to protest again, but Whitmore silenced her with a raised hand. "Not another word," he said sharply. "You've done enough damage." Rick tried to speak then, stammering, "We didn't know," but Whitmore cut him off with a glare that left no room for argument. "You didn't care to know," he corrected harshly. "You assumed, you judged, and you humiliated a guest who deserved nothing but respect." Evelyn stood silently beside him, her dignity restored not by words of her own, but by the undeniable truth of her identity and the chairman's public recognition of her worth. The room that had once been filled with laughter at her expense now vibrated with unease. Every person forced to confront the cruelty they had witnessed or participated in. For Evelyn, it was not just vindication. It was justice unfolding in real time, a reminder that arrogance and prejudice could collapse in an instant when faced with truth. The customers who had smirked, whispered, and laughed earlier now shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others whispering apologies to no one in particular, as though trying to erase their complicity. The atmosphere had changed in a heartbeat, and for the first time since Evelyn had entered the bank, the weight of injustice began to lift, though the scars of humiliation still burned within her. Whitmore's face, however, carried none of the warmth he had shown Evelyn when he turned to confront his employees. His jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to a low growl that carried through the silent lobby. "Suspend them immediately," he ordered, pointing at Linda and Rick. His assistants and the head of human resources, who had hurried in behind him, nodded quickly and began making calls. That was the first twist of this stage, the public suspension of the two figures who had humiliated Evelyn, carried out not in the privacy of an office, but in the full view of the very crowd that had been their audience of cruelty. Linda's confident smirk finally cracked, her face draining of color, while Rick's body stiffened as though he had been struck. The two additional guards looked away, clearly relieved not to be included in the order, though their unease showed they recognized how close they had come to sharing the same fate. Whitmore's voice grew sharper, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Escort them out of this building, now." His assistants moved swiftly, signaling to other guards who had just arrived to ensure order. Linda opened her mouth to protest, her voice shrill and panicked. "Mr. Whitmore, please, I was only doing my job." But Whitmore raised a hand and cut her off with a glare that silenced her completely. "Your job," he snapped, "is to treat every client with respect, no matter their appearance, no matter your prejudices. You failed spectacularly. You embarrassed this institution. And worse, you humiliated someone who has given more to this bank than you could ever dream of. You have no place here." Rick tried next, stammering, "I didn't mean." But Whitmore's eyes burned with anger. "You didn't mean? You grabbed her, you dragged her, you reduced her to entertainment for this lobby. Do not dare minimize what you did. You meant every word, every action, until the moment you were caught." Rick's face flushed crimson as murmurs rose in the crowd, customers nodding in agreement now that the tide had turned. That was the second twist, the complete reversal of authority, with Linda and Rick reduced from arrogant tormentors to disgraced outcasts, stripped of their power and marched out under the watchful eyes of those who had once cheered them on. As the suspended employees were escorted toward the glass doors, the lobby erupted not in laughter this time, but in hushed conversations and the snapping of camera phones. Customers recorded the scene eagerly, not to humiliate Evelyn, but to capture the downfall of those who had humiliated her. The sight of Linda and Rick being let out like criminals was too powerful to ignore, a symbol of arrogance collapsing under the weight of truth. One woman whispered to her companion, "That's what they get." Another muttered, "Serves them right." Jason Miller, still standing near the teller line, allowed himself a small, relieved smile. His earlier defense of Evelyn finally validated. The journalists who had been waiting in the lobby for unrelated appointments began scribbling furiously, their pens scratching across notepads, their phones already sending updates to their editors. Evelyn realized with a slow dawning clarity that this moment would not remain confined to the marble walls of Whitmore Bank. This story would travel, carried by the press, amplified by social media, discussed by people who had never met her, but who would recognize the injustice she had endured. Whitmore turned back to Evelyn, his face softening once more. "Mrs. Johnson," he said gently, "I am deeply sorry for what you've suffered. This bank has failed you today, and that is something I cannot forgive in my employees." Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she did not let tears fall. She had not cried when she was humiliated, and she would not cry now that she was vindicated. Instead, she nodded once, her voice steady though low. "I told them I belonged here. They did not listen." Whitmore bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of her words. "From this day forward, they will remember that you belong here more than any of them." Customers began to clap softly at first, then louder, until the entire lobby filled with applause. It was not the hollow laughter that had accompanied her humiliation, but genuine respect, a recognition of the wrong done to her and the courage with which she had endured it. Evelyn stood tall, allowing the sound to wash over her, her dignity fully restored in the eyes of those who had once denied it. As Linda and Rick disappeared through the glass doors, escorted firmly by the guards, a journalist snapped the photo that would soon appear on news sites across the country. Evelyn Johnson standing proudly beside Chairman Whitmore, while the disgraced employees who had mocked her were marched out in shame. Within hours, that photo would go viral, sparking debates about prejudice, dignity, and the arrogance of those who abuse power. For now, though, Evelyn remained silent, her presence enough to fill the room with truth. The glass doors of Whitmore Bank had barely closed behind Linda Parker and Rick Dawson before the weight of their disgrace began to ripple far beyond the lobby. Evelyn Johnson remained beside Chairman Charles Whitmore, her chin lifted and her silence radiating a dignity that filled every corner of the marble hall. Customers who had once laughed now whispered among themselves, their faces pale as if they had seen their own reflection in the arrogance that had just been exposed. The journalists in the lobby moved like hunters, their pens racing, their phones buzzing, their cameras flashing as they captured the image of a humiliated manager and guard being escorted into the street, while an elderly black woman they had mocked stood vindicated beside the chairman himself. The applause that had followed Evelyn moments earlier had faded, replaced by the soft hum of unease as people realized that this incident would not be contained within the building. It would spread, carried on headlines, videos, and posts that would force the world to confront the ugliness they had just witnessed. Evelyn did not seek the spotlight, but it was already fixed on her, and in the contrast between her grace and their cruelty, the story wrote itself. By the following morning, the consequences began to unfold. Major newspapers ran the story with headlines that screamed of racism and arrogance exposed at one of the city's most prestigious banks. Viral videos flooded social media, showing Rick gripping Evelyn's arm and Linda mocking her documents before being publicly rebuked by Whitmore himself. The image of Evelyn's calm, steady presence beside the chairman became the defining picture of the scandal, a symbol of both injustice and triumph. That was the first twist of this stage, the speed with which the private humiliation became a public reckoning, the kind of story that no corporation could silence or spin. Evelyn awoke to find her name trending, her face plastered across screens, her dignity restored in the eyes of millions who now knew the truth. But with the recognition came anger, a collective fury at the arrogance displayed by Linda and Rick, and at the bank for having allowed such behavior to fester. Inside Whitmore Bank, panic set in. Stockholders flooded Whitmore's office with calls demanding answers. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting, their voices raised as they debated how to contain the damage. Some argued that firing Linda and Rick outright was not enough, that the bank's credibility had been stained and would require more drastic action to restore trust. Others feared lawsuits, boycotts, and regulatory scrutiny, all fueled by the viral outrage that showed no signs of fading. That was the second twist. The scandal reached into the highest levels of power, forcing even those who had never stepped foot in the lobby to reckon with the arrogance that had been exposed. Whitmore himself stood firm, his voice resolute as he reminded the board of their responsibility. "This institution is built on trust," he declared, "and when that trust is broken, we must pay the price. We will not cover this up. We will face it." His words carried the authority of a man who had seen his legacy nearly tarnished, and who would do whatever was necessary to preserve it. Meanwhile, Linda and Rick faced their own downfall. Stripped of their positions, they became the subjects of relentless media scrutiny. Neighbors whispered about them, former colleagues avoided them, and online commentators tore apart every detail of their arrogance. Rick, once swaggering with authority in the lobby, now found himself hounded by reporters at his doorstep, his face plastered on news sites as the embodiment of abusive power. Linda, who had prided herself on her sharpness and her authority, now saw her name trending with hashtags that branded her as cruel and prejudiced. Their arrogance had not only cost them their jobs, but their reputations, their futures clouded by the stain of their actions. Evelyn did not rejoice in their downfall, but she could not deny that justice, in its own way, was unfolding. In the days that followed, the scandal continued to grow. Customers lined up to close their accounts, citing the viral videos as the reason they no longer trusted Whitmore Bank. Protesters gathered outside the glass doors, holding signs that read, "Respect all clients" and "Justice for Evelyn." The institution that had once prided itself on prestige now faced the reality of public shame. Its marble lobby transformed, in the eyes of the world, into the scene of arrogance exposed. Evelyn watched from a distance, her life suddenly thrust into the public sphere, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown in the lobby. She did not seek revenge, nor did she speak harshly of those who had humiliated her. Instead, she allowed the truth to speak for itself, and the truth was louder than any defense Linda or Rick could muster. Jason Miller, the young man who had tried to defend her, became a minor hero in the narrative, his face appearing in interviews where he described what he had seen. "I couldn't stay silent," he told reporters. "She was being treated unfairly. It was wrong, and I'm glad the truth came out." His words echoed what many now believed, that silence in the face of cruelty was complicity, and that Evelyn's grace had forced them all to confront their own failures. Evelyn herself was approached repeatedly by reporters seeking comment, but she remained measured, speaking only when necessary and always with the same calm tone that had carried her through the humiliation. "I only wanted to be treated with respect," she said simply. "I had a right to be there." Her words, so plain and yet so powerful, resonated with millions who had faced their own moments of dismissal and prejudice. The storm surrounding Whitmore Bank continued to swell, but at the center of it all, Evelyn Johnson remained calm, her dignity unshaken even as her story became a national headline. The viral videos, the angry protests outside the bank's pristine glass doors, the endless debates on television and social media had turned her humiliation into a symbol. And though she had never sought the spotlight, she carried it with quiet resolve. Chairman Charles Whitmore recognized that no public relations strategy or corporate statement could undo the damage done in that marble lobby. He knew the bank's credibility rested not only on money and policies, but on its ability to show the world that it had learned, that it had changed, and that it was willing to confront the arrogance that had nearly destroyed it. And so, within days of the scandal breaking, he organized a press conference in the very lobby where Evelyn had endured her trial of humiliation. The gold letters of the motto "Integrity and Respect for All Clients" still gleamed above the entrance. But this time, the words would be tested not by arrogance, but by action. The crowd gathered, journalists, customers, community leaders, and employees, all waiting to see whether the bank would defend itself or humble itself. Whitmore stepped to the podium, his expression somber, and motioned for Evelyn to stand beside him. Cameras flashed as she approached, her presence commanding the room in a way no title or wealth ever could. She was not just an elderly black woman anymore in the eyes of the crowd. She was a symbol of resilience, grace, and truth. Whitmore began with a voice heavy with sincerity. What happened here was unacceptable. It was cruel, and it was a betrayal of everything this institution claims to stand for. Mrs. Johnson came here as an invited guest and was treated as if she were less than human. For that, I offer not only my apology, but the commitment of this bank to do better. He paused, looking at Evelyn with genuine respect before continuing. This bank has prospered for generations, but prosperity means nothing without humanity. We must face the truth that arrogance and prejudice were allowed to flourish in our halls, and we must root them out. That was the first twist of this stage. The bank's leader acknowledging publicly and without excuse that Evelyn had been wronged, turning what could have been corporate spin into a moment of accountability. The audience listened in silence, the weight of his words settling over them. But all eyes shifted when Evelyn herself stepped toward the podium. She gripped its edges with frail hands, her back straight, her gaze steady. Her voice was soft at first, but every word carried, firm and clear. I have lived long enough to know humiliation. I have felt it in stores, on buses, in schools, and in places where I was told I did not belong. But what happened here was not just about me. It was about how easy it is for people to forget the humanity of others. They saw my age, they saw my skin, and they decided I was less. That is the cruelty that breaks not just hearts but societies. The crowd leaned forward, spellbound. But I stand here today not to destroy lives or to demand vengeance. I do not want to see people lose their homes or their futures because of a mistake, even one born from arrogance. I want them to learn. I want this bank and every person who hears the story to understand that respect is not optional. It is the foundation of justice, and without it, we are nothing. That was the second twist, the unexpected turn away from vengeance toward grace, a message not of destruction, but of transformation. Evelyn could have demanded the harshest punishment, and the crowd would have cheered, but instead she called for change, a call that cut deeper than any demand for retribution. Whitmore, visibly moved, announced the creation of the Evelyn Johnson Foundation, funded by the bank, dedicated to training employees in empathy, equality, and respect. The foundation would not only ensure that what happened to Evelyn would never happen again within Whitmore Bank, but would also work with other institutions to combat prejudice and arrogance in professional spaces. Applause thundered across the lobby, but this time it was not for corporate promises or financial figures. It was for a woman whose quiet strength had exposed injustice and turned it into an opportunity for growth. Evelyn stepped back from the podium, her hands folded in front of her face calm. She did not bask in the applause, did not smile triumphantly, but simply nodded as though acknowledging a truth she had always known, that dignity is not something given by others, it is something carried within, unshakable even when the world tries to strip it away. As the press conference ended, journalists rushed forward, cameras still flashing, questions still flying. But Evelyn moved slowly, deliberately, through the lobby. Some customers reached out, offering apologies. Others whispered words of admiration. And Jason Miller stood near the back, his eyes shining with pride for the woman he had tried to defend. Evelyn paused only once, placing a gentle hand on Jason's shoulder. "You spoke when no one else would," she said quietly. "Never lose that courage." Jason nodded, humbled, as Evelyn continued her walk toward the exit. The glass doors opened, and the sunlight poured in, bathing her in a glow that seemed almost symbolic, as though the world itself recognized her triumph. She stepped into the street, the hum of the city surrounding her, and for the first time since that morning when she had entered the bank, her chest felt light. She had endured humiliation, but she had not been defeated. She had revealed the arrogance of others without letting it poison her spirit. And she had chosen grace over vengeance, leaving behind a message that would outlive the scandal. That justice is strongest when paired with humanity, and that dignity is not just about standing tall when honored, but about refusing to bow when humiliated. Evelyn Johnson walked away slowly, her cane tapping softly against the sidewalk, her head held high. She was not just the guest of the chairman, she was the guest of justice itself, and her story would remind countless others that arrogance may wound, but truth and grace heal. The end. If you followed Evelyn Johnson's story all the way to the end, you know it wasn't just about humiliation inside a marble bank lobby. It was about dignity under fire, about arrogance collapsing when truth is revealed, and about how compassion in the face of cruelty can be the strongest form of justice. Stories like this remind us that injustice can happen anywhere, even in places that pride themselves on wealth and prestige. But they also remind us that the human spirit is tougher than arrogance and prejudice. If this story struck something in you, I would love for you to support it by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of Evelyn's choice to answer humiliation with grace instead of revenge? Do you think justice can truly change people, or are some lessons only learned when consequences come crashing down? And tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this reach people everywhere, and your perspective matters.